All right, to access the authentication session on the client, we have to go to our root layout that we have in the app folder and wrap our application inside a session provider component. This session provider internally uses React context to pass the session down our component tree. So on the top, let's import session provider from nextauth/React. Now, let's wrap everything we have inside the body inside a session provider. Okay, now back in the browser. Look, we get this error saying React context is unavailable in server component. Now you might think, okay, easy, we can go back and make this component a client component, but this is not possible because we get a different error saying you're attempting to export metadata from a component marked with use client. So to solve this issue, we have to wrap that session provider inside a separate client component. Let me show you how. So first, let's remove the use client directive. Now, here in our project, in the app folder, let's add a new folder called auth. In this folder, we add a new component called provider.tsx. Let's create a React component and call it auth provider. In this component, first we import session provider. Then we give it a children prop. So I'm going to destructure the prop right away and grab the children property. Then we annotate it with a type. We can define an interface separately or define it inline. So here we say that in the props object, we have a children property of type React Node. Okay. Now, in this component, we return a session provider and put the children right here. So auth provider is a wrapper around session provider. Now we make this a client component. Now back to our layout. We don't need to import session provider anymore. Instead, we're going to wrap our application with auth provider. All right, now take a look. The error is gone. So let's see how we can access the session in our navbar to show the user's name. So let's go to the navbar component. Here we have a hook called use session that is defined in nextauth/React. We call this and get an object with a few properties. Let's destructure it and grab status and data, which we can rename to session. Now, because we're using this hook, we have to make this component a client component as well, because with this hook, we access the context object that is passed using the session provider. Now, if you're not familiar with React context, I strongly recommend you to go watch my React course. I think I covered it in the second part. So here we have the status. Now, the status can be one of three values. It can be authenticated, loading, or unauthenticated. So here we can say, if status is loading, initially we return nothing, or we could return a loading indicator. Otherwise, we return this markup. Now, down here, we want to render the login link only if the status is unauthenticated. So let's wrap it in braces. And here we check if status is unauthenticated, then we render the login link. Now, otherwise, we can render the user's link. So here we can check if status is authenticated. Then we render a div. And inside the div, we render session.user.name. Now, the user property is optional because when the status is loading, we don't have a user object. But in this case, at this point, we definitely have a user. So here we can add an exclamation mark and tell the TypeScript compiler that we definitely have a user. Now, in this example, we have two separate conditions, but we could also use the conditional operator in JavaScript to say, if the status is authenticated, render this, otherwise render this. Either way works. Now, because in this component, we are using this hook and we are using React context, we have to mark it as a client component. So on the top. Let's add use client. Now back in the browser. All right, see what happened? Initially, we didn't see the navigation bar because the status was loading. So this is kind of a weird experience. We don't want to check the status over here. So I'm going to remove this line. Instead, we can check the status here. If status is loading, then we can render a spinner or a skeleton, whatever, or just say loading. Refresh. Here's what we get. If you don't like this experience, you can just leave out this line. And with this, initially we don't see the name, and then it appears after a second. Now, in this case, we didn't really have to convert this component to a client component because we don't need any interactivity here. We're not listening to any browser events or accessing any browser APIs. So this was just an example of how we can access the session on the client. In the next lesson, I will show you how we can access the session on the server, and with that, the current user's name won't flash like how it did in this video.